Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. This month marks the 30th anniversary of the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. It was very meaningful for me to be there on that day when it was signed. And for all the complexity of the Israel-Jordan relations, especially in light of the recent regional tensions and the Gaza war, it's important to note that the countries have maintained the peace treaty. Neither of them canceled it. Today, we're going to navigate the sharp contrast between the Jordanian monarchy's cooperation with Israel and its public's growing discontent, particularly since there is a large number of Jordanians that are of Palestinian descent. Despite quiet collaboration on key issues like water, energy, and security between the two governments, the disconnect has been a major source of frustration for both Israelis and Jordanians alike. We'll also examine the long-standing peace agreements between the two countries, and we'll talk about how Iranian proxies have sought to destabilize Jordan during the Gaza war, and we'll also talk about the shifting dynamics in domestic Jordanian politics with the recent victory of the Islamic Action Front or Muslim Brotherhood, and what it all means for the future of Israel-Jordanian relations. And I'm joined today by three experts who can help us navigate this split-screen reality. Marissa Horma is the program director of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. She has experience working in a range of development projects across the Middle East, and she served as the director of the Office of Jordan's Prince Ali bin al-Hussein. David Schenker directs the Linda and Tony Rubin program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute, and he's also the Taobi Senior Fellow here at the Washington Institute. He served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs through January 2021, and he was the Principal Middle East Advisor to the Secretary of State. Ephraim Halevi is an Israeli intelligence expert and diplomat. He was the 9th Director of the Mossad and the 3rd head of the Israeli National Security Council. He is known for his part in bringing about the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty of 1994. I want to welcome all three of you to Decision Points. So let me start with David and Marissa. I'd like you to set the stage for our listeners. How did we get to this point of mutual tension? You know, the treaty was signed in 1994. We're now in 2024. We're really coming up to a big anniversary. And the question is how did it happen that we have this, what looks like a split screen reality? Israel works quietly with the Jordanian security forces on destabilization aspects of the Middle East, whether it's ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, works with the Jordanian government on issues like water and energy. But the Jordanian public sees what it sees on television about the war in Gaza, and it didn't start with the war in Gaza. It seems like there's this mutual frustration where Israelis think that Jordanians don't fully appreciate the scope of the relationship on the inside, and Jordanians think that the Israelis don't understand the sensitivity inside the kingdom with a lot of people of Palestinian origin, given the visuals that they see. How did we get to this point of split screen reality? Was it built in from the beginning? Was it something recent? And how sustainable is it? David, why don't we start with you?
We're approaching the 30-year anniversary of Wadi Arava, and I don't think there's going to be a lot of public celebration of this treaty that has been so successful overall. We could start from the very beginning, but I think there's points along the timeline where a lot of bad blood has been generated. More recently, I think there's a distrust, certainly in Jordan, feeling, as you mentioned, that the kingdom is underappreciated, that there are a lot of stresses, that there's 60% or so Palestinian origin population. And this goes back well before what happened on October 7th and Israel's response in the war against Hamas. A couple years ago, we had an agreement for regional cooperation between Israel and Jordan, the Red to Dead. This was all signed and ready to go, and the Prime Minister of Israel canceled this. ostensibly because it was non-economical, that it was not the lowest price for water. And yet, this wasn't about economics. This was about regional cooperation and tying the two states together. And it put Jordan in a very bad position. This is obviously after years of sort of difficult interactions at the political level, put Jordan in a very bad position, and I think reticent to cooperate on other regional projects, whether this is the Jordan Gateway in the north, or even now the problems that are being encountered with what do they call it, the green blue with the Emirati cooperation. And the bottom line here is that Jordan has a 415-mile border with Israel. It is the only pro-West, peace partner, moderate, forward-leaning state that stands between Israel and Iran. And there hasn't been, I think, a sufficient appreciation for the difficult position that Jordan is both attacked by Iranian assets in Syria, Iranian assets in Iraq, not a great relationship with Saudi Arabia. They're in a very difficult position politically and economically, and I think that things, particularly with Gaza, have become really a poisoned well.
And Marissa, how do you see it?
I agree with David. I think the bottom line for especially the government is that it's not just a lack of appreciation of what Jordan does, but it's also a feeling that it's sometimes taken for granted. What makes this very difficult is that this is not a purely bilateral peace agreement. Of course, on paper it is, but the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian question is at the heart of that relationship. Most Jordanians view the relationship with Israel through that prism. As David mentioned, as you mentioned in your introduction, Jordan hosts the largest number of Palestinian refugees. Many Jordanian families are of Palestinian origin. It's very difficult to even distinguish families these days. I mean, I'm a native of Jordan of Circassian origin, but I have so many cousins that have intermarried with Palestinian families. So it's really very difficult now to sort of disentangle Jordanian society, to say that those are Palestinian and those are East Bank Jordanians and others are Armenian or Circassian. But nevertheless, I think the common denominator amongst all the different groups in Jordan is this affinity with the Palestinians. There's a familial affinity, there's a geographic proximity as well. And so this is at the heart of it. So before October 7th and before the war on Gaza, the headlines in Jordan on a daily basis on online media, on TV, and what they're watching on Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera are documenting day-to-day what's happening in the West Bank, less so in Gaza, but especially in the West Bank. They document every teenager who is being imprisoned, every settlement being approved, every settler attack that takes place. They see Israel through the prism of occupying Palestinian territory and of the repression and oppression that the Palestinians live under. And that is the prism through which they see Israel. And that's why you have strong anti-normalization sentiments that have been traditionally, even during the reign of King Hussein, that have been very active primarily in the professional associations, but also in parliament. And it is the one cause that everybody agrees on, even though the politics may differ. But especially in times of war, it really does bring Jordanians together. And of course, support for the Palestinians and what they're going through translates to anti-Israeli sentiments. In this current cycle, particularly, the U.S. is seen as complicit as well.
But Marissa, to follow up, and I think you really laid out very well about the frustrations of Jordanians who see Israel through the prism of the Palestinian issue. But do you also see how the Israelis feel frustrated that a lot of things that they do with the government of Jordan on security, on water and energy, I'm not saying that any of this is charity at all. Obviously, it is not. It's mutual interest. But do you feel that maybe some of that is not always conveyed to the Jordanian public, so they tend to see it much more in a one-way kind of way, and they don't see the benefits that are accruing as a result of this 30 years, even if it's a cold peace and not a peace between peoples, but maybe a peace between governments?
I think most people, if you start a conversation with Jordanians about this, most people understand the benefits, but the sentiments the emotions that come with basically looking at something like a water deal or gas, etc., or even trade, again, it continuously sees Israel through that occupation lens. I think the way that a lot of these agreements are framed, they're framed very carefully, sometimes not even mentioning Israel, because they know that this might trigger protests. We've seen so many different, with the gas deal, for example, there was a whole movement amongst some Jordanian youth who tried to come up with an alternative solution for Jordan and come up with different strategies, economic strategies to deal with that energy problem. And they even had an opportunity to talk to government officials about this. But of course, what they had at the table was not going to be an alternative in the short term, perhaps in the medium to long term. This is where it's important to have a more open conversation about why this peace treaty is in Jordan's national interests, why it's strategic, beyond the fact that we're just happen to be in the same neighborhood. And as you mentioned, we share the longest border. Jordan and Israel share the longest border. This is part of the challenge. Because everything is seen through that prism, Israel is on paper no longer an enemy because there's a peace treaty, but a lot of people see it through that lens because of what they see happening in the West Bank and in the last 11 plus months in Gaza.
Okay, Ephraim, over to you. You heard from David and Marissa that Jordan does not feel appreciated, as David and Marissa said, and then Marissa made the case that Jordanians see Israel through the prism of controlling the West Bank. As someone who was the architect of this peace agreement 30 years ago, how do you see this gap that is emerging? And do you feel that in Jordan that Israelis are not appreciating Jordan sufficiently, and what can be done about that?
But the problem began long before the peace treaty. It began when we had the Israel independence war. And one of the aspects of it was that very large numbers of Palestinians crossed the border and settled in the East Bank and settled in Jordan and ultimately became citizens of Jordan, also participated in the government of Jordan. And we had a situation in which people who came from Nablus and other places attained very, very important roles in some of the governmental positions. This was the beginning of the problem. The second problem was that over the years, there were upheavals in the Middle East, in Iraq and other places, and waves of people used to come in from the East after war, the Iraqi war, and other aspects of it. And we had a second wave of people who were not originally Jordanians. And after all that, we had the problem in Syria. We had the upheaval in Syria. We had several events which brought about millions of Syrians crossing the border and becoming people working in Jordan and living in Jordan, and also undermining the problems of work because they offered their workforce as doing things at a very lower price of wages that they obtained every month. So we had a combination of these three major aspects which changed the problems in Jordan in a very, very significant way. Above all this, we had for the last several long years a problem of water. The problem of water was a key problem, and when it came to the problem of water, Jordan suffered shortages of water. The only source that they could have thought of getting water was from Israel. And for the most of the time when Mr. Netanyahu was Prime Minister, including in the last few years, last many years, he always saw the water as a means of exerting pressure on Jordan and giving water to Jordan in exchange for whatever it is that he thought was a cooperation on the security and defense field. This mix of interests brought about changes in Jordan, especially after the death of the late King Hussein, and when Abdallah came into power and ultimately married a Palestinian from Nablus to be the Queen of Jordan. It made it even more complex and difficult to handle the situation. There was a time when Secretary Kelly of the United States, who was once Secretary of State, took upon himself the possibility of creating a new sort of order in the Middle East. And one of the ideas that he had was Jordan could produce electricity and Israel could give water. And therefore, in the end, there would be a meeting of interests in which each side was able to provide what the other side didn't have. But this was a very short time and it was not implemented. And when Kelly left, the whole project more or less collapsed.
It's called like the Green Blue, which the Emiratis were financing. And Kerry has had the climate advisory job at the White House under the Biden administration, just for our listeners who don't know.
Yes. All this meant to say everyone has their own interests. The main thing from the Jordanian point of view was Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's been in office for a very long time, considered the water as a lever. And the basis to development only a couple of months ago was that after Jordan cooperated in downing 40% of the missiles which were fired one night from Iran into Israel and crossed the Jordanian airspace, in exchange for that, Netanyahu said that he would be giving Jordan water for the next half of the year. And that's where we stand at the moment, which means to say that this situation is a situation which is taking on difficult aspects of the situation in Jordan, because ultimately all these long and perpetual presences of people who are not originally Jordanian became a very, very serious problem that His Majesty had to deal with.
Marissa, I want to go to you and then David, ask your thoughts. Ephraim raised the whole issue of the relationship between leaders, between Prime Minister Netanyahu and Jordan's King Abdullah. Like I said, there's been a split screen reality where a lot of the security people and other people have worked very well together behind the scenes. And yet on the political level, the relationships seem terrible. And you could say, well, you can't disconnect it from what's going on in the society. But I want to know, to what extent is this a factor? We've also seen Queen Rania very vocal during the Gaza war. How much do you feel, Marissa, that the poor relationship on the leadership level is affecting the overall climate between these two countries?
I think it's a very significant factor. A lot of Jordanian officials, those who are key advisors and officials in the government, do not see Bibi Netanyahu as a partner for peace, not only peace with the Palestinians, but not even a partner to deepen the peace treaty with Jordan. Ephraim just mentioned how the water factor was used to add pressure on Jordan. There are other examples that could be brought to the fore as well, where the Bibi government had also pressured Jordan. I think for most people, the rise of the right in Israel and Bibi's embrace of the right was quite disconcerting, because for many of these folks, and we've heard it from the ministers in the government, the Jordan option, or the alternative homeland option, that used to be an idea that only the right spoke about when they were basically a minority and fringe, right? But now they're part of the government and they're still talking about it. I mean, it's no surprise that at the UN General Assembly yesterday, King Abdullah said it very clearly. He said Jordan will never be an alternative homeland for the Palestinians, and we will not allow for that to happen. So this is an existential issue for Jordan. It's an existential threat. And so when it's coming from members of the government and you do not see Prime Minister Netanyahu trying to reassure Jordan that that's not the official position, and especially in these times of war, a very intense war, it only adds more fuel to the fire. And that's why we see the foreign minister of Jordan and Queen Rania basically go out and talk about what they believe is a horrific war that is basically being fought at the expense of innocent Palestinians.
David, I want to ask you, you were in the U.S. government, you were the top Middle East official at the State Department. You see this terrible relationship. Do you think this could be ameliorated at some points if maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu would do as Marissa suggests, which is distance himself from some of these comments of members of the government Is there any way to repair the Netanyahu-Abdullah relationship, or has this been going on for so long that it's not repairable? I mean, I should say, to be fair, when Itamar Ben-Gvir went on the Temple Mount, the Haram al-Sharif, and talked about building a synagogue, Netanyahu says, this is not our policy. Our policy has not changed. Netanyahu was someone who would work with the king. Actually, I think when Kerry was Secretary of State, to come up with this compromise idea of on the Temple Mount, which is Jews can visit there, but they don't pray there. And he said it, even there's an audio of him saying this publicly. So I'm just wondering how bad the leadership, personal relationships are, and what is repairable and what isn't, and how is the Queen's remarks during the war. And we know Ayman Safadi, as Marissa said, has been very vocal consistently in the Jordanian parliament and other forums in Jordan. How much does the leadership tension contribute to this problem, and what could be done to improve it just on the leadership level?
This has been a problem for a long time. I think the memories of 1997 and Netanyahu engineering the attempted assassination of Khaled Mashal in Amman are still fresh.
This was someone who's very still active with Hamas. So just for our listeners who don't know who Khaled Mashal is.
I don't think Jordanian leaders have a problem with Israel's right. I think they prefer the left, but they don't have a problem with the right. Rabin, I think on security issues, is pretty far right. Sharon, they didn't have a problem. I think they had confidence in these people that they were telling the truth and that they understood the import of stability and well-being of the kingdom. The leadership of Jordan, the palace, worked well with these people. And Netanyahu, not so much the case. We still have, it's not just Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, it's Israel Katz, who, shows up with maps that don't show Jordan on the map.
This is the foreign minister.
The foreign minister of Israel. And that Netanyahu still has in his government these people who actually want to implement what is Jordan's worst fear, which is to drive a third intifada that would result in the potential expulsion of large numbers of Palestinians in the West Bank into the kingdom. Many in the kingdom are convinced that this is the policy objective of several sitting members of the current Israeli cabinet. This is a problem, and I don't think that's going to get any better. I think on the professional level, whether this is, security relationship with the experts, the professional security people in Israel and professional people in Jordan, the relationship is excellent, and there is enormous amount of mutual confidence. Lastly, let me say there has traditionally been a division of labor in Jordan, and that is that the palace doesn't really comment on these issues, that it is the government. Right? You'd have Ayman or Nasser or Judah or any of the previous foreign ministers go out and speak their mind on what's happening in Israel, Israeli policy, Gaza, etc. It's changed slightly. The Queen now is a vocal critic of Israel, and so this has brought it to the palace, I think, sort of unprecedented or unusual for the kingdom. But the relationship between Jordan and Israel can be improved. It can be salvaged. After the war, we can work to improve this. To get back to where we were, it may take years, just because of popular sentiment and the fact that it is kryptonite. Israel is kryptonite right now for Jordanian politicians, meeting out in the open, etc. But the fundamentals, hopefully, after Gaza, will remain the same, which is that there is a strong mutual interest at the highest levels of the Jordanian and Israeli government and ruling elite to maintain and build on this relationship because it serves both nations and both peoples.
Ephraim, you in your previous job as, head of the Mossad, you were always able to convey quiet messages between Israel and Jordan and Israel and parts of the Arab world that didn't have diplomatic relations. Do you see there's something here that could be repaired in back channels to ameliorate some of this tension between leaders? Or do you think between Prime Minister Netanyahu and King Abdullah, it's just hopeless and there's nothing that could be done? I mean, what if we did what Marissa said and what David said and just would say, here, Mr. Prime Minister, can you say, like you did on the Temple Mount / Haram al-Sharif, that Israel's policy has not changed about prayer? Could you do the same thing about the issue of Jordan as Palestine, of people at the fringe of the government who are saying things suggesting that they want to push Palestinians out, which is clearly not Israel's position? Are there things that Israel could say on the leadership level that would be meaningful, as you see it, given your knowledge of Jordan, that would be meaningful to the Jordanian side? What could be said publicly? What could be said privately that would improve these poor sets of relationships?
We're surely going to mark the event of 30 years of a peace treaty towards the end of October. If you look back and see how many of these years were the years in which Mr. Netanyahu was in power, you'll see that he was the person who had more influence on the Israeli side than any other Israeli leader, prime minister, who was shorter terms. And I don't think that at this particular stage it would be possible suddenly to have a change of heart with Mr. Netanyahu. I think probably if he was free, he would be free to restructure the Middle East. He would probably, to some extent, support the idea that the Hashemites, as I say, Hashemite dynasty, which was given the right on the Temple Mount through the peace treaty with Jordan, should be changed, and that Jordan should be replaced with Saudi Arabia. And I think that is the idea which has been around for a very long time. I think it would be a mistake for Israel to play around with this. The fact of the matter is that Israel did play around with this, and this became known to King Abdullah, and of course annoyed him immensely, to put it mildly, and rightly so from his point of view. It would not be possible for anybody outside the parties to come in and to propose to them proposals of one kind or another. Concerning the Temple Mount, the problem is very, very complex. It's very complex because the present composition of the Israeli cabinet is such that we have people there from the extreme right, religious people who believe that Israel should have more or less, or the Jews, to put it simply, should have the major right on the Temple Mount. Although Mr. Netanyahu has feebly issued statements in recent weeks and months that there would be no change in the status quo, in practical terms, I think that if it was possible from his point of view to bring about a change, he would be probably very supportive of it. I don't think that people from the outside the region would have a capability of doing something. I don't think that the United States of America has the power to change this in any meaningful way. Although I think that recently, in many ways, Jordan, under the leadership of King Abdullah, has been very supportive of the United States' interests in the Middle East and has been awarded with quite a very hefty degree of support from the United States on an annual basis. I don't think that things can be done until there is a change in regime in Israel and until the situation in Syria is settled, which is not the case, and people who came down from Syria would return back to Syria and rehabilitate themselves in Syria. Palestinians who came back from the Persian Gulf should go back to the Persian Gulf in one way or another, but this entails a different climate. The present climate at the moment is a very different climate, as we all know. You know, we know. We have the Iranians who are also a player in all this in many, many ways. They're going to be a player with even more influence. Now there's been a change of regime in Iran, and the new regime is very creative in the way it is going to deal with these problems. It would be presumptuous and probably ill-advised that we sitting this afternoon in the way we are, and others similarly, would provide a menu of steps to be taken by the parties, whereas the parties themselves don't really need anybody else from the outside. They can sit down between themselves, but they don't seem to be indicative of this at the moment. I have my contacts with Jordanians quite frequently in many ways, which I will not detail at the moment and will not serve a useful purpose. But I will say is we'll have to wait for a different time when the entire scenery here is changed, when we have the war over in the south towards Gaza and the north against Lebanon and in one way Syria. All this fighting which is now going on is not the time to try and to offer a menu of steps to redesign the Middle East in one way or another. I think it would be necessary for us to design this on our own. I don't think that we can talk about all this without talking about the West Bank, which is a very, very important player in all this. And I think that, with all due respect, we would not be able this afternoon in Washington to work out at this particular point in time a plan which would deal with all the problems that you have mentioned.
I think we all see how the West Bank is intertwined in the bilateral friction. It's hard to imagine the bilateral relationship improving unless there is a dimension of dealing with the Palestinian issue. David, you've written and talked about the security dimension. With all the tension, the fact that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, are smuggling in a lot of weaponry, not just into the West Bank, but also into Jordan to destabilize Jordan. I'm wondering, to what extent, given all your experience on this issue of the U.S., Jordan, Israel, and the Middle East, to what extent do you think that this arms smuggling issue is somewhat of a wake-up call to remind people, hey, people, this is a lot at stake? Just like for Israelis, the fact that Jordan helped foil the April 13th, 14th attacks from Iran, and there was part of a wider coalition and a reminder to Israel about what the Middle East could be. But the fact is that there's not the luxury with Iran trying to be a destabilizing force for Israel and Jordan to quarrel endlessly, even if they cooperate behind the scenes on security. So I'm just wondering, to what extent do you see the Iranian arms smuggling as a factor in this equation? Could it bring Jordan and Israel closer?
Remarkably, Jordan has become the priority and the prize for Iran. It sees Jordan as vulnerable, economically weak, divided population, and of course, a population that has some sympathy, if not with Iran, then for Iran's objectives vis-a-vis Israel. Unlike the other states that Iran has destabilized, whether Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan doesn't have a Shia population to speak of, so it's harder to get a foothold there. Jordan doesn't provide visas to Iranians. There aren't Iranians running around making pilgrimage, the so-called pilgrimage in Jordan. But they are every day sending things into Jordan. And for much of the past 5 years, let's say, or 6 years, that's been Captagon coming from Syria, the amphetamine, the Assad regime, and Iran and Hezbollah favor for their narco-trafficking throughout the region. More recently, I think within the past year or two, we started to see a lot of weapons move into the kingdom. We've seen threats by the Hashid, the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, to send people and weapons into the kingdom, not only to attack Israel, but to attack the kingdom's interests, whether that be destabilize the kingdom, attack U.S. forces that may periodically be based in the kingdom. This is very dangerous. So some of these weapons are moving onward, whether this is C4, claymore mines, explosives, rifles. But Jordan is really a key partner, not only of Israel, but in this sort of international coalition to defend themselves against Iran, and are doing a really remarkable job of preventing them from moving into the West Bank. Some weapons are making it to the West Bank. We hear Israeli politicians talk about it all the time. We see it on the ground, the type of roadside bombs that the IDF is encountering in the West Bank. I think probably a majority of this material was coming from leakage from Israeli military bases or coming out of Gaza at this point. But this is dangerous because a lot of the weapons that are coming in to Jordan are likely staying in Jordan and are meant to target not Israel, but the kingdom. Perhaps there's an area for more cooperation here. Israel and the GID are working hand in glove on these issues. The IDF working with the Jordanian military, the Mossad, the Shin Bet. I mean, all these things are working and important. The United States can provide more equipment, assistance, aerostat balloons, other things to the Jordanians. I think that would be helpful. But in the long term, Israel will depend on the goodwill of Jordan to protect its own borders. And they are critical. And maybe there are areas for cooperation, as I said, but I think overall the best thing would be if Israel wraps up the war in Gaza, stop its ministers from saying things that are really problematic within the kingdom and stirring up, I think, bad sentiment.
So, Marissa, when you hear these reports about the arms smuggling by the Revolutionary Guards, And it's not just transiting through Jordan to the West Bank, in Jordan. And there's no doubt people think Jordan is doing its best and Israel wants to work with it to help. Do you think this somehow puts some of the differences in perspective that says, okay, we've had our quarrels on some big issues like the Palestinian issues. This is an important issue, not just in Jordan, but beyond. But let's remember strategically that there's a whole regional dimension here to this relationship, and we have to be sure that the kingdom isn't destabilized, and we need to do what we have to do to make sure these weapons do not come in to destabilize the Hashemite kingdom.
It is a common national security threat that will definitely and have brought the security apparatuses closer on coordination. I think that this is also done in close collaboration with the United States because Jordan is heavily dependent on military assistance from the US to counter all of these different threats. But primarily, as you said, and as David also reiterated, that Jordan is seen as vulnerable because of the political pressures as well as the economic pressures. And that's where the economic component has to be addressed. The United States should continue to support Jordan economically, exert pressure where needed on the government to move forward with reforms that have been stalling for many years. And then I think what would also move things forward is that, yes, there is this common thread that brings us together, but the continuation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from the perspective of Jordan allows Iran to roam even more freely because Iran thrives in a region that continues to have pockets of conflict, whether it's in Syria or basically instability in Iraq or a vacuum in Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon. Those are all prime examples of why the United States has to work with its key allies, with Israel, Jordan, other allies in the GCC, to also address these conflicts, but primarily for Israel, because of the West Bank and Gaza, because of the Palestinian-Israeli issue, to address that. And I think that has always been part of the Jordanian thinking, that has always been presented as such. Let's resolve this conflict. Let's ensure that we are defanging Iran because they thrive in this environment of instability and war. And unfortunately, they do it really well. They have a very extensive network. I want to add one more point here, because if the Iranian threat is presented to Jordanians a little bit more clearly, I think, you will see a very strong anti-Iranian sentiment. I think they will be able to separate the two issues, basically the Palestinian issue from the Iran issue. Because when you look at polling, Jordanians have very high trust in the security apparatus and in the military, less so in the government. But when it comes to the security, they support the security because it's all about safety and security. This has to be also emphasized. They have to be a bit more clear about what that presents to Jordanians, the threat that it presents.
Marissa, we didn't get a chance really to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and their success in the Jordanian parliament recently. Do you attribute it to the Palestinian issue? Do you attribute it to the other regional dimensions in dealing with Iran that somehow they're fomenting? Of course, the Brotherhood is Sunni and Iran is Shia.
So is Hamas, but they still took support.
But so is Hamas. Exactly what I wanted to say. Do you see the Brotherhood success? Why did that happen?
Because again, they thrive when there is a war. They are, as you said, like the Islamic Action Front is Muslim Brotherhood, so is Hamas. All of these groups will stand together because they don't see borders. The Islamic Action Front has always operated within limits that the Jordanian government and the security apparatus have been very clear about. They have organized most of the protests. That's not to say that others did not also organize, they did, but they have constantly used that to rally support. But then Jordan also has economic issues, economic challenges, a workforce challenge, an investment challenge. Do they have an agenda for the economy? No. I mean, they've proven before that they cannot even run government institutions. That is what also needs to be reminded to the Jordanian people. And I think that this whole notion of thriving and being influenced by Iran, I think there is an aspect to it, but I think that the security apparatus is also very clear about how they operate and constant reminders that you are a Muslim Brotherhood organization, but you're Jordanian first.
Ephraim, I want to give you the last word. When you look at these security challenges of Iran towards Jordan, do you see this as something that will bring Israel and Jordan closer together? Marissa made an important point about how Iran is only exploiting the differences on the Palestinian issue, the Gaza war, for its own benefit. How do you see Israel and Jordan coming together to thwart Iran's efforts to destabilize Jordan, to destabilize the West Bank? How do you see it?
I think you've chosen a very bad day to discuss this in this light. The current situation here in Israel is that there would be very little time and effort to expend on this issue, although it's an important one. Just this morning, we had a missile attack on Tel Aviv for the first time, coming out of the north, Hezbollah targeting the headquarters of the Mossad. The missile which was launched was destroyed in the air, but that is only a very significant event in Israel's history at the moment. We have to understand that the situation with Jordan is a very, very complex one, not only for the reasons we've discussed this afternoon, but also because of the fact that there is no real fence on the border of Israel and Jordan today. You can walk across from Jordan to Israel or from Israel to Jordan, just walk across it just as if you're walking across Constitution Avenue or something like that. The effect of what is happening on so many areas would probably prevent Israel from devoting real, serious, in-depth consideration of how to repair relationship between us and Jordan. I think in the end, it will not be possible as long as Mr. Netanyahu is in power. What I do think is, and that is something I want to end with, that the recent change of regime in Tehran and the new president of Iran is a breath of fresh air into the Middle East as a whole. He's just now been addressing the U.S. Assembly yesterday in New York, and he was very critical of Israel, of course, but he's also a very serious person. There are many changes happening simultaneously. Iran is one of them. You mentioned Iran. I think that it's very possible that Iran is on the verge of several very important changes in its policies and in the way it conducts its domestic affairs. There has to be, in order to address the points you've raised this afternoon, it's important to visit what is happening in all the other players in the region, including Israel, by the way, because I think that in the end, after this round of war, this first year of the war, which we've had to such an extent in the last 12 months, and probably the war will not end in which Israel is involved in the next year. It'll probably take longer than that. So we have time to see where we can work this out. From this point of view, the one figure in this issue is an important one, and that is Bill Burns, who was the director of the CIA. Bill Burns was the American ambassador to Jordan when we were working out the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. And he's very much aware of what all these issues are, and he's held in very high esteem by King Abdullah of Jordan. If you're looking for somebody who can talk to the king in a meaningful way, and if you're looking for somebody who has experience of the Middle East as he has, I think as long as he's in his present position, I don't know how long it will be, depending on the result in your election, there is a possibility that if the United States, after the election for the presidency, will devote to this issue attention, and if Bill Burns can be a key figure in this, that is an important contribution to the possibility of changing much of what we'll be discussing this afternoon.
Well, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I want to thank all three of you for really a very candid, sobering look at a very critical relationship at a very different juncture for the Middle East. I think your candor has been very helpful. I want to thank you all for joining us today on Decision Point.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
We just had an important discussion with David Shaker, Marissa Khorma, and Ephraim Halevi. As we explored today, the Israel-Jordan relationship is one fraught with complex dynamics. While the long-standing peace between the two governments remains intact, the challenges like the Gaza war Iranian proxy activity and domestic pressures within Jordan continue to test the resilience of this bilateral relationship. But despite these strains, we've also seen opportunities for deeper cooperation, particularly in security, but the road to repair will be long and difficult. As we move forward, key questions remain. Can the political relationship between Israel and Jordan be salvaged, especially under the current Israeli leadership? How will Iranian efforts to destabilize Jordan impact regional security? And most importantly, what steps can be taken to ease tensions and rebuild trust between these two critical neighbors in the Middle East? At the same time, if the relationship between Israel and Jordan has been resilient enough to withstand the war, it shows us that this bond, despite being tested perhaps more than at any other point in the last 30 years, does have strength to endure. While it's difficult to predict how the relationship will emerge from this Gaza conflict, this resilience suggests to me that the two sides have the capacity to maintain and perhaps even rebuild their ties moving forward. I want to thank all of our listeners for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Rena Gaber, Simone Sadmeyer, Sydney Hilbush, and Gabriel Epstein. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can continue to grow this community. Subscribe to Decision Points on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts. To our listeners from all over the world, thank you for listening to this season of Decision Points.